Freedom didn't come to save me. It first tore me apart, layer by layer, until I was confronted with what I had always run away from. And only then did it give me the chance to truly piece myself back together. In this audiobook, you won't find any magical solutions or words meant to wrap you in cotton wool. I didn't write it to soothe your wounds, but to show you that you can walk away from any place where you no longer feel alive. Every sentence here was born from a real case. I'm not speaking from on high, but from the very core, from the rubble, from the dirt, from the decisions that hurt but set you free. This is not a story about overcoming. It's a story about choice. I chose my freedom, and I paid the price for it. If you're ready to look at your life without filters and to stop justifying what's destroying you from the inside, then let's begin. Chapter 1. The day I stopped justifying the unjustifiable. It wasn't a special day. No glowing sign announcing that in this very moment my life would take a new direction. No dramatic music. No cinematic revelation. It was a gray afternoon, emotionless, nondescript, and yet something inside me cracked. Not a loud shattering, more like a fine hairline fracture in a wall, appearing after years of silent tension. But this crack could no longer be ignored. And that is exactly where everything began to fall apart. Up until that moment, I had been living according to a script I'd learned. One that I replayed constantly without questioning. I told myself that everything was fine, that you had to be patient, that love could hurt. And that's just adult life. Swallow, endure, persevere. I spoke as if I needed to convince myself that the fire burning in the back room was just decorative. I had gotten used to borrowing other people's words, living with borrowed thoughts, sugarcoating what hurt me just so it fit into the picture of normality. For a long time, I considered it maturity when I understood others' behavior, even if it was destroying me. I thought it was a sign of greatness to give in, to hold back, to show understanding. I became a master at finding reasons to stay when I had already wanted to leave long ago. I found explanations for everything. The shouting, the silence, the emotional starvation, that constant feeling of fighting for my existence. I told myself it wasn't so bad, that others had it worse, that nobody's life is perfect. And the more I tried to downplay it, the smaller I became. The trap was silent, because not everything that hurts screams. Sometimes you die inside slowly, without a visible sign, simply through the sum of years spent losing yourself. Because giving in once feels harmless. But when you always give in, when you constantly negotiate with yourself not to explode, to preserve harmony, to avoid drama, then one day you stand in front of the mirror and don't recognize yourself anymore. And then that day came. No argument, no drama. Just that one moment when I heard myself justifying something deeply wounding for the 100th time. I said it without any feeling, like someone who's forgotten how to feel, just to keep up the illusion. And right then I knew. I was lying to myself. It wasn't about the others anymore, not about the circumstances. It had become my own game, a strategy to deceive myself so I didn't have to act. I don't remember if I cried. I don't know if my hands were trembling, but I remember that inner image. I saw myself clearer than ever before. A woman, exhausted, not screaming, not desperate, just empty. A woman who had long since given up on herself, not out of weakness but because she'd had to be strong for far too long. That was the bitterest truth. I was no longer the victim of the situation. I had become an accomplice in my own prison. From the outside, you couldn't tell a thing that day. I went to work, held conversations, smiled, cooked, brushed my teeth. Everything as usual. But inside me, something had shifted. Something had broken open, and it could not be patched up. For the first time, I let go. Not of the outside, but of the necessity to deceive myself. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge that my pain was real, and that I didn't need anyone's permission to take it seriously. Seeing things clearly wasn't pleasant. It was brutal. I felt naked, exposed. I almost felt ashamed of how many times I had betrayed myself just to keep up appearances. I felt guilty for wanting to leave, for thinking of myself, for questioning everything that people call a stable life. But at the same time, I felt a kind of relief. For the first time in years, my thoughts, feelings, and words began to move in the same direction. And even though it hurt, it finally felt honest. I had no plan, no list, no system. Just one decision. I would never again justify what was tearing me apart inside. I would stop finding reasons to stay in a reality that made me sick. And that meant questioning everything I had built until then. Relationships, routines, convictions. It was as if I were tearing down my house with my bare hands, not knowing whether I would ever build a new one. But the urge to finally be honest with myself was stronger than any fear. Stopping the justifications wasn't an easy path. Every decision afterward was an inner battle. I encountered disappointment, misunderstanding, silent withdrawal. Some people distanced themselves. A few called me overly sensitive. Others said I was overreacting or going through a phase. I heard many things, but I stopped explaining myself. Because when you choose your own truth, you lose your audience. And that's okay. What I gained instead was a new respect for myself, a clarity I had never known. I began to ask myself with every pain, am I sugarcoating this, or do I truly feel it's wrong and just don't dare name it? The answer was often uncomfortable, but that discomfort became my compass. I stopped trying to drown out the other person's silence. I stopped confusing understanding with self-abandonment. I stopped getting lost in explanations that only pulled me further away from myself. What had settled inside me over years began to dissolve on that nondescript, silent day. The day I replaced the thought, maybe I'm overreacting, with, I don't have to accept this anymore. That mental shift was the beginning of everything. Because once you stop justifying the unjustifiable, you start reclaiming yourself. You gain space, time, dignity. And once that happens, there's no turning back. Because when you see yourself with clear eyes, you never want to live blind again. And that, no matter how much it hurts, is the first real step toward freedom. Chapter 2. How I became the warden of my own prison. There's something unsettling about realizing that the chains holding you aren't coming from the outside, that you put them on yourself, quietly and carefully, almost with devotion, not out of malice, not out of stupidity, but out of fear, upbringing, a misunderstood sense of duty. It took me years to admit that I was the one who locked the door and threw away the key. I was the one who told myself when to stay silent, when to apologize, when I was too much, when I was not enough. I was the one who monitored, chastised, and restrained myself. And the tragic thing is, I thought I was doing it for my own protection. I don't remember exactly when it started, but at some point that inner voice, constantly correcting me, belittling me, putting on the brakes, became the norm. It told me what was appropriate, what took up too much space, what counted as selfish. It was merciless, often harsher than any external criticism. And I listened because it felt like reason, like decency, like maturity. But it was fear. Fear of abandonment, of rejection, of being inconvenient. So I built my own prison, brick by brick, with the best of intentions. I said no to things I truly wanted simply because they didn't fit the image others had of me. I held back so as not to be too loud. I hid my tears so as not to appear weak. I remained silent even when I was screaming inside. And each time I censored myself, I reinforced the bars. I wasn't imprisoned because someone else locked me up. I convinced myself that I belonged there. The insidious thing is, you don't notice it for a while. You call it adaptation. You call it responsibility. And you believe that you are becoming more mature for it. But what really happens is continual shrinking. You become smaller, quieter, more agreeable, and eventually you don't recognize yourself anymore. I had taken on roles I never consciously chose, the sensible one, the functional one, the one who has it all under control. It was convenient for everyone, and I was proud of it because I thought it was strength. But deep inside me was a growing emptiness. I remember moments when I rebelled internally. Flashes of thought like, I don't want this, or why am I doing this, would spark, but I pushed them away. Because questioning yourself is exhausting. Because it hurts to realize you've spent years surviving rather than living. And because you're afraid of what happens when you finally stand up and say, I'm not doing this anymore. I had moved my boundaries so many times that I no longer knew where they genuinely lay. I said yes when I meant no. I nodded when my gut screamed no. I showed understanding when I was furious. And I told myself that was magnanimous. But it was self-betrayal. It was the quiet surrender of my own truth in favor of external peace. I functioned like a clock, perfectly set, reliable, but hollow inside. At some point I realized I wasn't making decisions anymore. I was merely reacting to expectations, to pressure, to what others needed. I was no longer the subject of my own life, but an object. I had forgotten that I have the right to take up space, that my needs aren't negotiable, that love doesn't mean forgetting yourself. But that had been lost under layer after layer of duty and fear. The hardest part wasn't opposing others, but confronting my own inner system, those convictions I'd accepted as truth. I had to learn that self-care isn't a luxury, that setting boundaries isn't selfish, that saying no doesn't equal rejection, that nobody benefits if I lose myself just to keep things superficially harmonious. I had to unlearn myself, teach myself new phrases, allow myself to be loud, allow myself to be inconvenient, allow myself to have needs without immediately downplaying them. It was like an internal reconstruction, piece by piece, with setbacks, fear, and sadness. Because it also meant admitting how long I had abandoned myself, how often I had betrayed myself out of fear of conflict, how much I'd conformed until there was nothing left that was truly mine. I began to observe myself, not in order to control, but out of genuine curiosity. I wanted to know what I really thought when no one was listening, what I wanted when no expectations were placed on me, who I was when I didn't have to please anyone. And the deeper I dug, the more I found my way back to a version of myself I had nearly forgotten. One that wasn't perfect, but was alive. One that wasn't playing a role, but was real. And that wasn't always pretty. It was raw, chaotic, contradictory, but it was genuine. And that was more than I had felt in years. I realized that freedom doesn't announce itself loudly. It often begins quietly, with a single thought, an inner resistance, the phrase, I don't want this anymore. And it takes time, patience, courage. Because the greatest fear isn't that others will reject you. It's meeting yourself without excuses, without masks. And yet I took that path, not because I suddenly felt powerful, but because I could no longer bear to keep holding myself down. I didn't become free overnight, but I began to open the door for myself, just a little each day. I allowed myself to ask questions, to think out loud, to set boundaries. And I noticed the walls around me weren't made of concrete. They were built of fear, false loyalty, outdated beliefs, and they started to crumble the moment I stopped defending them. Today I know I was never truly imprisoned. I had only forgotten that I have the right to decide, that I have the right to choose, that I can leave, that I can speak up, that I don't have to please everyone. And even though there are still moments when that old voice returns, whispering, "Be careful, be quiet, fit in," I hear it, but I no longer follow it. Because I am no longer the warden of my own prison. I am now the one who holds the door open for myself. Chapter 3. Breaking does not mean failing. For a long time I believed that anything that breaks is a sign of weakness, that something that ends must inevitably be judged a mistake, that you have to lose in order to win, but that this losing carries a silent shame best left unspoken. That's how I was raised. That's what I was shown. That you must endure, that you must stay together, that you mustn't just give up. And that very attitude held me back for years from seeing that there is dignity in letting go. That breaking isn't always a misfortune. Sometimes it's the only path to an honest life. I remember a time when I was almost panicked trying to hold everything together. Relationships long since drained, structures where I no longer recognized myself. I was willing to bend, to apologize, to make myself smaller, as long as it held. Because deep down, I had internalized the idea that stability is the highest value, that something that remains matters more than something that's true. I was so afraid of ending up the one who fails that I preferred to remain in inner stasis rather than allow change. What I didn't understand back then was that there comes a point when continuing is not courageous, but cowardly. A point when holding on becomes self-denial. And the worst part, I felt it. My body knew. My sleep became restless. My thoughts spun endlessly. I grew twitchy, irritable, exhausted. But I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to be the one to give up. Meanwhile, I had long since checked out. I just hadn't found the courage to say it out loud. Breaking isn't failure. It's often the logical result of honesty. When you're no longer willing to lie, when you no longer want to hide, when you no longer want to wake up every day feeling you've betrayed yourself. It takes strength to break something you've poured years of energy into holding together. It requires clear vision and a very deep breath. And sometimes the admission that you were mistaken about people, ideas, the promises you made to yourself. I didn't take that step easily. Everything inside me rebelled against the thought that I should end something I had built myself. It felt as if I were giving up part of myself, as if I were admitting defeat. I had invested so much, time, love, nerves, and now I was supposed to let go. It felt unfair, and yet I knew. Staying would cost me more than leaving. The first moments after that decision weren't liberating. They were hard, quiet, but heavy. I had expected relief, but instead came a deep, silent grief. Not only for what I'd lost, but also for what never was. I had to say goodbye to an illusion, the idea that I could save something that was already consuming me. I had to admit that my own hope was sometimes my greatest enemy, because it prevented me from seeing reality. Breaking is painful, yes. It comes at a cost. It brings loneliness, doubt, criticism. It brings reactions you can't control, people who don't understand you, who turn away, who see your decision as an attack. And still, breaking was necessary. It was the moment I drew closer to myself, when I was no longer busy functioning but for the first time truly felt what had been building up inside me. I remember an evening when I sat on my living room floor, crying, breathless, confused. I felt empty, but for the first time also honest. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to pretend I was fine. It was a heavy moment, but also a truthful one. And I think that's something many underestimate. How deeply truth can shake you, but also how much it can heal. In hindsight, I see that breaking wasn't my end. It was a transition, a cut, yes, but not a final break from myself. More like the opposite. I began to realize that you don't always win by saving something, and you don't always lose by giving something up. Sometimes ending something is an act of love, not out of hate, not out of spite, but because you recognize that what once was meaningful now only drains you, weakens you, holds you back. There were people who asked me then if I'd regret it, if I was being too impulsive, if I should reconsider. I understood their questions. They came from a desire for security. But what they didn't see was the price I had already paid, the part of me that had died slowly over all those years of clinging on. I couldn't explain that. I just had to do it, for myself. Today I know. I had to break in order to grow anew, not in the same form, not with the same colors, but from myself, with different roots, with greater clarity. And that was not a defeat. It was maturation, one that hurt but was necessary. I learned that you don't always have to finish entire stories. Some can end openly, some can fade away quietly, and that makes them no less valuable. I believe we must stop fearing breaking. We must stop hiding it, shaming it, sweeping it under the rug. It's part of life. And more than that, it's often the moment we first realize who we really are, when no one is watching, when there are no more roles to play, where there's only us, raw, wounded, but real. Breaking does not mean failing. It means facing the truth, letting go, making space for what comes next. And when I look back now, I don't see failure. I see courage. I see the woman who chose not to live against herself any longer. And that was, perhaps, the first true step towards self-respect. Chapter 4. When they told me, "You weren't like this before." It wasn't a particularly aggressive sentence, no loud accusation. It came quietly, almost incidentally, in a conversation that seemed unremarkable. Yet it hit me like a blow. You weren't like this before. They said it with a tone of reproach mixed with wonder, as if I had become a stranger, as if I had transformed into someone incompatible with the image they had of me. And that was what really hurt. Not the sentence itself, but what it said about our relationship. That apparently I was only right when I remained as they knew me. Quiet, agreeable, predictable. I remember my first feeling. Guilt. As if I had done something wrong, as if by growing I'd broken an unspoken agreement. I should have asked permission to change. I should have perhaps prepared them. But I didn't. I simply moved on. I began to say things I would have swallowed before. I said no where I used to say yes. I contradicted. I became more direct. And suddenly that was enough to alarm people who had grown comfortable with the version of me that never set boundaries. The truth is, I had always been this way. I just hid those thoughts, doubts, dreams, that fire inside me for too long. To avoid disturbance, to avoid questions, to belong. I played the role they assigned me, the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who fits in. And the better I played it, the harder it became to step out of it. Because people don't just get used to you. They get used to the version that's most useful to them. The sentence, "You weren't like this before," often really means, "I don't like how you are now because I can't control you anymore." I realized that too late. At first, I searched for the problem in myself. I softened, became cautious, offered explanations, tried to tone down the change. I didn't want to offend, didn't want to lose anyone. But what I overlooked was that in doing so, I was losing myself again. In the attempt to grow while keeping everyone comfortable, I nearly shattered myself once more. Change doesn't feel the same for everyone. For you, it might be liberation. For the other, a threat. For you, it might be a step toward self-respect. For the other, a loss of control. And yet, it is necessary. Because once you continue to develop, you inevitably disappoint those who would rather keep the old you. The you who never caused conflict. The you who never held up a mirror. The you who apologized before even stating a point. I learned that not every discomfort signifies that I'm overreacting. Sometimes it signifies that I'm standing upright for the first time. That I'm no longer willing to apologize for my clarity. That I have no problem if someone is disappointed because I no longer function under their rules. I stopped justifying my change. And yes, that has something to do with pride. With an inner yes that is greater than the fear of not being liked anymore. It's absurd how often we try to conceal our growth. We minimize it, add qualifiers, relativize it, just to avoid losing the other person. I remember conversations where I almost apologized for having become clearer, as if I had to explain why I no longer wasted my time, why I no longer settled for half-hearted compromises, why I no longer made myself small so that others wouldn't feel challenged. But eventually I understood that it's not my job to protect others from my development. I don't have to be ashamed of having changed. I don't have to stay in old patterns just because they're more comfortable for others. Because I'm not here to keep up a role that no longer fits me. I'm here to be alive. And sometimes that means reinventing myself. Not because the old was wrong, but because now I know more, feel more, want more. Change is not capitulation. It's a decision. And yes, it brings loneliness. It divides. It sorts people out. But it brings you back to yourself. I had to learn that not everyone questioning you does so out of concern. Often it's a need to keep you in a place where you pose no threat to their worldview, to their habits, to unspoken dependencies. It takes courage to break free from those bonds. And it takes time not to perceive every "you're different now" as an attack, but as confirmation. Today I know that this sentence, harmless as it may sound, was a turning point. It forced me to look honestly. Who am I now? Who do I want to be? And what am I willing to give up to stay true to my own development? I chose myself. And that meant not going back, not downplaying what had grown big within me, not pretending I was still the same, because I wasn't. I'm not. And that's a good thing. Chapter 5. I was tired of speaking the language of silence. It's a language you don't learn but adopt. You grow up immersed in it, almost unconsciously. You watch others speak it, downcast eyes, halting breath, a smile that lingers too long. It's the language where you don't say what hurts, where you'd rather swallow it than contradict, where you make yourself small so you don't disturb the space. And I spoke it fluently, for too long. I don't recall exactly when I began censoring myself. Maybe it wasn't one moment but a series of small experiences, glances that told me I was too emotional, silences that punished me for being too honest, smiles that confirmed it was better to function than to feel. And so I learned to hide my truth, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. I didn't voice what I needed. I made no demands. I didn't even ask questions if the answers might hurt. I adapted, became cautious, overly cautious, almost silent. I was so afraid of losing someone that I preferred to lose myself. I became a master at enduring, at accepting, at keeping quiet. And the tragic thing is, I was praised for it, for my maturity, my patience, my inner strength. What they didn't see was the price I paid, because every unspoken truth grew heavier. Every moment I held myself back dug deeper into me. I began to disappear, not physically but internally. I sat in conversations and wasn't there. I smiled and thought at the same time. Say something, do something. But I did nothing. I remained silent, out of habit, out of fear, out of exhaustion. The language of silence is treacherous because it makes you believe you're creating harmony. In reality, you're denying yourself, and the longer you speak it, the more you lose access to your own voice. You forget what it sounds like to stand up for yourself. You get used to being bypassed, and eventually you feel guilty for opening your mouth. You wonder if you're overreacting, if you're too sensitive, if you're imagining it all. I was tired, not just physically but spiritually. I was tired of functioning, enduring, pretending. I wanted to be heard, but I didn't speak. I wanted to be seen, but I didn't show myself. I waited for someone to look past my facade, to take me seriously, to ask what was really going on inside me. But how could they? After all, I was the one always saying it was fine. Until one day I realized I couldn't continue like this. I was sitting at a kitchen table in one of those typical conversations where everything's discussed except the essential. And suddenly I thought, I'm not here anymore. Not because I don't want to be, but because I've disappeared inside this construct of avoidance and adaptation. I knew if I didn't speak up now, I would lose myself. Not in a dramatic, visible way, but slowly, inexorably, for good. So I spoke. At first, hesitantly, in fragments. I didn't say much, but what I did say was real. And it was a shock, not only for others, but also for me. I had forgotten my own voice, its timbre, its edge, its warmth. I heard myself and knew instantly, that's me. Not the one who ducks, not the one who nods while screaming inside. I was back. But returning to the language of truth was not a smooth path, because someone accustomed to silence has no practice confronting. I was afraid of reactions, of rejection, of conflict. I weighed every word, turned sentences over in my mind 100 times before uttering them. But I knew, if I didn't do this, I would lose myself again. And this time, I wasn't willing to pay that price. I said what I no longer want. I said what I'm missing. I said what I need. And with each sentence, something in me grew. No arrogance, no defiance, but dignity. I didn't have to shout. I just had to stop being silent. And the more I spoke, the clearer it became who wanted to stay and who couldn't stand with me in my truth. It hurt to see some people turn away, to see my courage for clarity perceived as an attack, to hear myself labeled difficult simply because I refused to suffer in silence. But I realized it was never my task to keep things comfortable for others. It was never my responsibility to compensate for their discomfort. It was my duty to take myself seriously, and that means making myself heard. Today I speak, not always loudly, not always perfectly, but genuinely. I say no when I mean no. I no longer remain silent about what matters to me. I no longer apologize for having needs. And if that makes others uncomfortable, that's no longer my problem. Because I've learned, the language of silence never brought me peace. It trained me to stay quiet, not to live in truth. I was tired of passing over myself, tired of carrying the invisible burdens that no one wanted to see, tired of disappearing within myself just so it would be calm on the outside. And that's why I started listening to myself, speaking up, claiming myself for everything I am, everything I think, everything I need. Not to provoke, but to finally live. And living begins where hiding ends. Chapter 6. The times I betrayed myself to avoid upsetting anyone. I've lost count of how many times I kept my truth inside just so the mood wouldn't turn. How often I nodded, even though everything inside me contradicted it. How often I dismissed my own needs, not out of conviction, but out of fear of disappointing, irritating, or confronting someone. I had become a specialist in retreating, in smoothing things over, in enduring. Not because I was conflict averse, but because I had internalized that harmony was more important than honesty. I remember countless situations in which I put my needs last. I made space. I listened. I sacrificed. I smiled when I should have cried. I comforted when I really wanted to scream. I stayed silent when every fiber of my being wanted to speak up. And each time I betrayed myself, I quietly told myself it was necessary. That it wasn't so bad. That I was stronger for giving in. But it was bad. Not each individual occurrence in isolation, but in the sum total. Because with every concession, I lost a piece of myself. A small fragment of dignity here. A shard of self-respect there. And eventually, only a functioning shell remained. One that had learned to interrupt itself before anyone else could. I was so focused on not disturbing anyone that I became the problem myself as soon as I occupied any space. I adapted to conversations where I barely existed. I laughed at the right moments, even when I didn't feel like it. I said, "It's fine," when it was anything but. I said nothing when something mattered to me, all so I wouldn't be labeled difficult. From the outside, it looked like maturity, but inside it was a slow withering. I convinced myself I was generous, patient, understanding. In reality, I was cowardly, terrified of the reaction, terrified of what would happen if I actually voiced my truth. Some people sense this. They know when you recoil before things get critical. They learn how far they can go without you defending yourself. And if you continually demonstrate that you'll step back, they come to expect it. That you'll be the reasonable one. The one who gives in, the one who never erupts. And you in turn grow accustomed to that role, until you forget that you were ever more than that. I often wondered what would have happened if I'd raised my voice earlier. If I'd been consistent. If instead of staying silent, I'd walked away from the table. Maybe I would have lost people. Maybe I would have been branded selfish. Maybe I would have disappointed others. But I wouldn't have disappointed myself, and that matters far more than I admitted at the time. Because there is a certain kind of pain you only feel when you live against yourself, when each day you force yourself to be smaller, quieter, more compliant. It's a pain that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come in tears or rage. It manifests as emptiness, as exhaustion, as the feeling of never truly belonging, despite constantly giving your all to achieve exactly that. I had to learn eventually that betraying myself does no one any favors, that my ability to avoid hurting others cannot justify hurting myself, that my desire for peace must never cost me my own essence. I had to learn that I'm allowed to be inconvenient, that my opinions matter, that my boundaries are not negotiable. And that was a long process. Because you don't simply wake up one day and declare, "From now on, I won't." It's an ongoing struggle against old patterns, old voices in your head, against the guilt that arrives the instant you start taking yourself seriously. I fought many inner battles before I spoke the words, "No, this cannot continue," out loud for the first time. I remember one conversation in which I didn't back down. It wasn't a major conflict, no heated argument, just that moment when I realized I have a choice, and I chose myself. I said what I thought, calmly, clearly, without drama. And what happened? Nothing catastrophic. The world didn't end. The other person was surprised, maybe even unsettled. But for the first time, I was proud of myself. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't lost myself. Since then, so much has changed. I speak up sooner. I walk away when I feel my boundaries disrespected. I no longer stay out of politeness. I refuse to bear the unspoken as I once did. I am no longer willing to sacrifice myself just to make others comfortable. And yes, there are consequences. Relationships shift. Some dissolve. New ones form. But the most important relationship, the one with myself, has finally become honest. I've learned that I don't need to be tougher to protect myself. I simply need to stop betraying myself. I don't have to fight. I just have to stand firm, within myself, with what I truly want, what I truly feel, who I truly am. And holding that space, even if it unsettles others, is not an act of rebellion. It's self-respect. I no longer ponder whether I'm inconvenient. I ask whether I'm being true to myself. And if the answer is yes, I can live with anything else. Because the pain you feel when you abandon yourself is the only pain that never heals. And I've decided never to allow it again. Chapter 7. Being strong didn't save me. It hid me. It's almost admirable how deftly you can feign strength until you start believing it yourself. I was praised so often for my strength, my calm in the midst of storms, my ability to endure, my composure when others would have long since crumbled. I heard things like, "You're so strong. I don't know how you do it." And I smiled, said thank you, and tightened my armor as if to prove I was truly unshakable. But what they didn't see, and what I refused to acknowledge, was that this strength was not freedom. It was a defense mechanism, a survival strategy, a facade I had put on so early that I forgot I could ever take it off. And the more I was lauded as strong, the less I dared to be weak, because I'd learned that strength was what people expected if you didn't want to be a burden. For years I hid behind that role. I functioned, I organized, I cared for everyone else. I was the one you called when things got bad. I was the one you turned to when you didn't know what to do. I was the strong one. And no one ever asked how I was doing. Not because everyone was selfish, but because I never gave them any other option. I smiled through exhaustion. I listened when I lacked the energy to order my own thoughts. I helped while I fell apart inside. And eventually I came to believe that was normal, that I simply endured more, that I needed less, that my tears were worth less than those of others. Being strong was how I avoided drowning, but it was also why I never felt truly seen. How could anyone recognize me if I continually drowned out my own voice, if I never left room for doubt, if I was so adept at maintaining control that no one even thought to ask about my inner world? The truth is, I was afraid, not of failing, but of falling and never rising again. So I stayed upright, no matter how heavy the burden. I didn't want to be a burden to anyone. I didn't want to appear needy. I didn't want to be the one who needed help. And in that relentless pursuit of control and composure, I forgot that real strength doesn't lie in endurance, but in vulnerability. There were nights I couldn't sleep because of the tension I couldn't release, because of the internal pressure to remain in control, because of the sadness that had no outlet. Since I'd forbidden myself even that right, I told myself, "You've got this," so often that I forgot how to recognize when I didn't. Then came the moment. Not a breakdown, no cathartic sob, just a slow, quiet realization that I no longer felt myself. I moved through my days like through a fog. I was everything to everyone, but nothing to myself. I sat in my living room amid to-do lists and expectations and felt only emptiness. And that's when I understood. I wasn't strong. I was good at hiding. I had buried my weaknesses so thoroughly that I couldn't remember what it felt like to be vulnerable. I'd grown so accustomed to having solutions for everything that I treated myself like a project, optimizable, controllable, predictable. But none of those traits felt genuine. None allowed me to breathe. None gave me what I craved most: connection, both with myself and with others. So I began the slow process of undressing myself, not literally, but of shedding everything I'd learned about strength. I started saying no, even when people didn't like it. I began asking for help, even when my voice trembled. I allowed my tears without apology. and each time I removed a piece of my facade, I felt something in me soften, become more authentic, more alive. The world doesn't end if you admit you're tired. It doesn't collapse if you sit down and say, "I can't go on." On the contrary, it starts to realign, because you finally open the space to take yourself seriously, not as a machine, not as an unbreakable rock, but as a human being with limits, with insecurities, with a heart that sometimes simply needs holding. Today I know that strength is a dangerous ideal if it means losing yourself. I no longer want to be strong if it renders me untouchable. I no longer want to be strong if it means I'm never held. I no longer want to be strong if it obscures the moments when I break inside. I want to be real, with all that entails: tears, fear, courage that is quiet and steadfast. And yes, I will continue to grow, to fight, to walk my path, but no longer to appear strong, for that was only hiding. I will do it to be free, and freedom begins when I stop hiding behind my own strength. Chapter 8. The body speaks when the mouth falls silent. It took me a long time to understand that my body is not my enemy, that it doesn't mysteriously fail when I'm supposed to function, that it's not weak when it grows tired, even though I have no reason to be. I spent years ignoring, dismissing, fighting its signals. I laughed off headaches, downplayed insomnia, chalked heart palpitations up to stress. Time and again I forced myself to keep going, even when my innermost being had long since raised the alarm. Because I thought it was normal, because I thought that's how it had to be, because I thought everybody else managed it too. But eventually I realized my body wasn't rebelling. It was speaking on my behalf when I couldn't. It began to scream because I refused to listen. Every tension, every tremor, every tightness in my chest was the expression of something I wouldn't say out loud, something I repressed, shoved aside, or masked. And today I see. My body was always honest with me. I just wasn't ready to hear it. It starts quietly. Sometimes it's just a heaviness when you wake up. No pain, no illness, just that diffuse sense that something's off. That there's a fatigue not caused by lack of sleep. That you're exhausted not by doing, but by being. And still you dress, you go to work, you smile, you reply, you organize. You tell yourself, it'll pass. And that's when the game begins. The game of fighting against yourself. I remember a period when I was chronically ill. Nothing dramatic, but one thing after another. Stomach, neck, headaches. I went from doctor to doctor, ran every test, sought explanations. Everyone told me I was healthy. Yet I didn't feel healthy. I felt drained, empty, hollowed out. And I began to question myself. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just too sensitive. What I didn't see was that my body had already voiced what I dared not. I can't live this way anymore. I clung to relationships that hurt me, stayed in conversations that wounded me, pretended everything was under control while collapsing inside. And my body, patient, loyal, observant, carried the burden of my denial until it could bear no more. Fear wears many faces, and my body showed them all. Heart racing for no reason, sudden sweats in calm moments, breathlessness at night. I Googled symptoms, made lists, practiced breathing exercises. But I forgot the simplest question. What am I clinging to that's making me sick? I was so focused on silencing the alarm that I never asked why it had sounded in the first place. Today I know. The body doesn't lie. And when it speaks, it's not because it's weak, but because you've been too strong for too long. It isn't your problem. It's your truth. And if you don't heed it, it will grow louder and louder until you can no longer ignore it. I have often wept, not from pain, but from relief. when I finally allowed myself to feel what I truly felt, when I stopped explaining or minimizing, and simply became still to listen to my innermost self. It was like returning to something I thought lost, myself. The body is not your adversary. It's your last warning when you've ignored yourself too long. It wants you to stop suffering, to pause, to look, to become honest. And sometimes that means taking a break, even if no one understands. Sometimes it means saying no, even if it surprises everyone. Sometimes it means ending things that function only so that you can breathe again. I began to judge my days by how my body felt, not by how life looked or how it appeared to others, but by what felt true inside me. Whether I breathed shallowly around certain people, whether my shoulders tensed at a decision, whether exhaustion crept in when I betrayed myself. And every time I met that truth with honesty, I received an answer. Quietly, gradually, unmistakably. Today I decide not with my head alone, but by listening to the tremor in my voice, the twist in my gut, the warmth or chill coursing through me. I take my body's messages seriously, and often they're simple. Stay here, or leave now, or rest, or simply, you may live differently. I believe the greatest betrayal we commit against ourselves isn't making the wrong choice, but ignoring the signals meant to guide us. The body is wise. It reminds you of yourself when you've forgotten. And the sooner you learn to take it seriously, the clearer your path becomes. I had to lose much to understand that. I had to go silent, to weep without knowing why, to stand still while everyone else ran. And finally I realized that wasn't regression. It was homecoming. To myself, to what I really need to be whole. And that voice, the one that speaks within when the mouth remains silent, I hear it today more clearly than ever. Chapter 9. The Price of Not Belonging. There are moments when you're surrounded by people, laughing, listening, responding, and yet you feel you're not really there, not inwardly, not on equal terms. You don't fit into the conversations, the dynamics, the unspoken rules. You sit there, maybe holding a glass, and you think, what am I doing here? And though no one excludes you, and though you could theoretically belong, there's that quiet, piercing sensation that your place isn't genuine but only tolerated. For a long time I tried to belong, not because I craved recognition, but because I believed belonging meant safety. I wanted to be part of groups, of family structures, of circles where certain things could be said, and others not. I didn't want to stand out, to cause a stir, to be inconvenient. So I adapted. I spoke the group's language, even when it wasn't mine. I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. I stayed silent at statements that made me cringe. I stopped contradicting, and each time I censored myself to fit in, I paid a price. Sometimes it was my peace, sometimes my self-worth, sometimes my entire inner compass. Yet I did it anyway, because the pain of exclusion initially felt far sharper than the quiet, chronic pain of self-denial. People talk a lot about authenticity, but almost no one tells you what it truly means to live it. It sounds so lovely. Be yourself, stand by your truth, follow your path. But no one warns you what happens when you actually do it. When you stop adapting, when you start speaking plainly, setting boundaries, withdrawing from conversations that drain you, standing up if the space suffocates you, then it gets silent. Rooms grow cold. You lose connections you thought were stable, not because you changed, but because you finally showed up. I remember a weekend with old friends, people I'd shared so much with, people who thought they knew me. And suddenly, in the middle of conversation, I felt estranged. Not because they'd changed, but because I was no longer the same. I spoke my mind without rounding the edges. I omitted my polite smile when I didn't feel like it. I asked a question no one wanted to hear. and I felt the atmosphere shift. No confrontation, no outburst, just that subtle silence telling me I no longer fit. That moment hit me hard, not because of their reaction, but because I finally grasped the cost of belonging when it demands your self-betrayal. I couldn't go back to the old pattern. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't play along when the game was rigged against me. And that meant stepping out, removing myself, not out of arrogance or spite, but out of respect for myself. Not belonging is lonely. It's uncomfortable. It casts doubt on everything you built your social life upon. Because if you no longer adapt, few will remain. Those who stay are precious, but the road there is solitary. You'll have evenings when you wonder if you're overreacting, too sensitive, if maybe you should take a step back. But eventually you stop asking yourself those questions. Not because they no longer arise, but because you already know the answers. You remember how it feels to hand yourself over at the door. You remember silencing yourself to make others comfortable. And you know that isn't belonging. It's an arrangement, a silent pact that you're allowed to stay only if you don't show up. I've learned that real connection only forms when I'm willing to be visible, with my edges, my thoughts, my contradictions, and that there's no shame in leaving a space that can't bear that visibility. I've learned that my dignity is non-negotiable, that I'd rather be alone than betray myself just to be included. Today I choose more carefully where and with whom I am. I sense quickly if I shrink inside when I listen too long, if I lose myself when I remain silent, and when I feel it, I leave, not dramatically but quietly, withdrawing, not because I don't want to belong, but because I cannot abandon myself any longer. The price of not belonging is high, but the price of losing yourself is higher. And when I choose today, I choose myself. Chapter 10. When I began making decisions, despite my fear. I always believed you could only act once fear had vanished, that the right moment arrives when you feel safe, clear, sure. I waited for that moment, through days, months, sometimes years. I told myself, not yet, you're not ready. And I mistook that for wisdom, though it was fear disguised as patience. So subtle, so convincing that I called it foresight. And so I postponed decisions that were long overdue, that had already whispered to me, you know what you must do. Yet I hesitated, wrapping my procrastination in rational arguments. I gathered opinions, asked for advice, even though I knew no one could answer what only I could. I analyzed until I was exhausted, and in the end, I stood still while life moved on. The fear never vanished. It didn't shrink. It only quieted, more sophisticated in its whispers, telling me it wasn't yet the right time, that I needed more knowledge, more stability, that safety mattered more than freedom, that nothing should be rushed. And I listened for years, because I thought it wanted to protect me. Maybe it did, but it protected me from something I grew to fear more than any change, from myself. I remember a decision I should have made long before. I knew deep down that I had to leave a path that was making me sick, that I had to close a door that only opened outward. I knew it not intellectually but viscerally, a knot in my chest that never went away. And still I stayed, out of fear, out of loyalty, out of the desire to hurt no one, out of the illusion that clarity would come on its own. But clarity didn't come. What came was exhaustion. And then, finally, anger. At myself. At my endless waiting. At the voice that kept shrinking me. And in that anger, in that rebellion against my own hesitation, I made the choice. Not because I was ready, not because fear had disappeared, but precisely with it. I trembled. I could barely breathe. I imagined the worst-case scenarios 100 times. And yet, I went anyway. I spoke the words. I took the step. And what I learned in that instant was this. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in its presence. Despite it, even against it, if need be, but never without it. I used to think the brave were people without fear, that they carried within them a clarity I lacked. I believed they were different, stronger, more resolute, more steadfast. Until I myself walked forward with shaking knees and realized that it's not extraordinary people who transform their lives, but people who finally have enough of standing still. People tired of waiting for a moment that never comes. People who decide that staying in fear costs more than stepping forward with it. Since then, I've made many decisions that frightened me, decisions I knew would bring consequences, that I might lose people, security, approval, comfort. Each time, fear was there again, disguised as doubt, as reason, as inadequacy. And each time I said, I hear you, but I'll move forward nonetheless. Because I've learned that fear does not mean something is wrong. It means something matters, that something inside wants to grow. And growth hurts, change hurts. But standing still when you already know you must move forward, that hurts in a way that slowly destroys you from within. There is no guarantee that decisions made with fear will become easier, no insurance that things will improve immediately. But there is a truth I can't forget. Once you move, something shifts. In you. Not loudly, not spectacularly, but palpably. Something straightens. Something stops fighting. Something whispers, finally. I haven't learned to live without fear. I've learned not to treat it as the end, but as a threshold. And when I feel it now, I know something waits for me. Something bigger than my need for control. Something braver than my desire for safety. And sometimes all it takes is that one moment when I remind myself, you don't have to be ready to go. You just have to stop betraying yourself. I no longer wait for everything to be resolved before I decide. I decide when I feel I'll keep running in circles otherwise. I no longer wait for perfect conditions, nor for a fear-free version of myself, for that will never come. But what does come is the version of me that acts, that hesitates, yet speaks, that trembles, yet walks on. And that is enough. Chapter 11. Walking doesn't mean giving up. It took me a long time to understand that walking away doesn't automatically mean fleeing, that letting go isn't synonymous with failure, that a retreat isn't always surrender, but sometimes simply survival. Far too often I held on for far too long because I was afraid of seeming weak, because I thought anyone who leaves has already lost. Whoever stays is the strong one, the loyal one, the one you can count on. I learned that it's brave to endure, but nobody taught me that sometimes it takes even more courage to loosen your grip. I stayed long after I'd already left in my heart. I sat at tables where I had nothing left to say, carried on conversations my heart wasn't part of. I wore masks out of politeness, out of loyalty, out of a need not to disappoint anyone. I maintained relationships whose foundations had long crumbled, simply because I thought that ending them would be a betrayal of the story, of the shared time, of the other person. And in doing so, I betrayed myself the most. Walking away can seem cruel, cold, selfish, and I often felt exactly that way. I wasn't proud of my decisions. I wasn't relieved. I was sad. I felt guilty. I wrestled with myself, and time and again I tried to find reasons to stay, because the fear of losing something irretrievable was often greater than the fear of losing myself if I stayed. I convinced myself that I simply hadn't given enough yet, that I hadn't tried everything. that I hadn't been patient enough. But there comes a moment when you realize you can't give any more without exhausting yourself. That you can't be any more patient without dissolving into nothing. That you can't keep starting over without ending up unrecognizable to yourself. And then it becomes clear. What you're trying to save may not be savable anymore. Maybe it's already over, but nobody has dared to say it out loud. Maybe it's just habit, or fear, or the need not to take on the role of the one who gave up. I learned that walking away can be an act of self-respect, not impulsive running, but a deliberate, painful, and often very lonely turning away. Not against the other person, but for myself. For the woman I have become. For the one who is no longer willing to forget herself just so something can endure that no longer reflects who she is. And yes, it wasn't easy. There's no medal for letting go, no applause. Often there's only silence, or misunderstanding, or even anger, because your walking away confronts others with what they refuse to see. Your departure says, I choose me. And in a world that elevates conformity and perseverance, that feels like a provocation. I remember the day I ended a friendship that had accompanied me for years. No dramatic story, no major betrayal. Just that creeping feeling that I was denying myself by staying. That I was pulling back too often, explaining myself too much, remaining silent too often so as not to disrupt the dynamic. And when I finally said it aloud, not with accusations but with honesty, there wasn't the relief I'd hoped for. There was sorrow. But it was a clear, pure sorrow, without regret. Because I knew it was necessary. I had believed for far too long that I had to see things through to the bitter end to remain true to myself. But in truth, I stayed truest when I had the courage to end something that kept me small. I had to learn that my worth doesn't depend on how long I endure, but on how willing I am to listen to myself, and to believe myself when I feel, here, I'm falling apart. Walking away doesn't mean I didn't give anything. It means I stopped sacrificing myself. It means I recognize that I can't save every relationship if I lose myself in the process. It means I granted myself the space I deserve to breathe, to speak, to grow, without constantly running into walls built of expectation, guilt, or fear. Today, I believe we too often try to be strong in the wrong places. We stay even though our hearts have long since gone. We fight on when there's nothing left to save. We cling to ideas, to hopes, to memories, and call it love, or loyalty, or duty. But sometimes true love is exactly the opposite. Sometimes love for myself is silence. Stepping back, walking away. Not because I don't care, but because I can no longer deny myself. I'm not proud of every time I walked away, but I am proud of what it has given me. Clarity, peace, a space within me no longer occupied by constant adaptation, a forward-looking gaze instead of an eternal holding on to what was or could have been, and above all, a new trust in myself, in my feelings, in my inner voice that once stopped whispering and began to speak loudly. Walking doesn't mean giving up. Walking means not giving up on myself. It means recognizing when something is over, even if nobody says it out loud. It means not waiting for the right ending, but deciding for yourself that your peace is more important than a perfect conclusion. And when I think today of all I have let go of, not because I loved too little, but because I didn't want to lose myself anymore, I know this: I haven't become less. I have become clearer. Chapter 12. The day no one applauded, and I kept going anyway. It wasn't a big step, no loud moment, no breakthrough you could instantly recognize from the outside. It wasn't a fresh start where someone patted me on the shoulder or said, I'm proud of you. It was simply a day when I made a decision that demanded everything of me, and nobody saw it. No applause, no look that said, I know how hard that was for you. Just me, my inner struggle, and that quiet, uncomfortable feeling of moving forward when everything in me wanted to stay put. I was used to being recognized for what I accomplished, for what was measurable, for what served others. Good grades, reliable work, care, conformity, patience. Everything that functioned quietly but looked orderly on the outside garnered praise. I was lauded for being strong, for enduring, for not rebelling. And eventually I got used to confirmation always coming from outside, as if it were a seal of approval telling me, you're doing it right. But on that day, and on many that followed, there was no one. No one to witness my internal fight, how hard it was not to slip back into the old patterns, how much it cost to say no, even though my entire body was still conditioned to please. No one saw me utter my boundary with a trembling voice. No one knew I didn't know what would come next, that I was afraid. But I did it anyway. I spoke my needs. I chose myself. And I knew it was the right thing. It just didn't feel like a victory. There was no relief, no liberating moment. It was raw, quiet, unfamiliar, and yet incredibly real. I no longer had to please anyone. I didn't have to justify myself. I didn't have to wait for someone to validate my truth. I had lived it, and that was enough, even if no one noticed. I long believed that growth is something you celebrate, something that comes with pride, recognition, visible change. But the truth is, the most important steps are often the ones nobody witnesses, the ones you take entirely alone because you feel you'll suffocate otherwise. Steps that need no stage because they're not made for the show, but for your life, for your inner balance, for your peace. I learned that it takes tremendous courage to go for yourself when no one is watching, when there's no one to tell you you're on the right path, when you're the only person who knows how much it cost you to get up today, to speak the truth, to take a step in a direction that is new and uncertain. It's easy to move forward when you're carried. It's easy to be brave with applause at your back. But what truly changes you is the moment you carry yourself. Without cheers, without an audience. I remember an evening when, after one of those decisions, I sat alone on my sofa. There was nothing to do, nothing to organize, no one to impress. I was simply there, with myself, and I felt everything. The fear, the exhaustion, the weight of the unknown. And yet I knew. Today, I acted for myself, without an audience, without a facade. And it was one of the most genuine moments of my life. I learned to listen to myself even when the world stays silent. I learned not to measure my successes by reactions, but by how true I remain to myself. There are days when I take a small step and feel deep down that it cost me more than all the visible achievements of recent years. And precisely for that reason, it's so valuable. We live in a society that confuses visibility with significance. What isn't shared seems not to count. What isn't applauded seems not to have happened. But I no longer believe that. I believe in quiet greatness, in what happens between the moments, in the invisible decisions that change you even if no one ever hears about them. Because you don't shape these decisions for others, you shape them for yourself. Today I sometimes applaud myself inwardly. Not loudly, not dramatically. I simply acknowledge what I've done. That I didn't stay silent when it would have been easier, that I stayed when it got uncomfortable, or that I walked away when no one pushed me to. I notice it, and I tell myself, you kept going, and that counts. I expect no applause anymore, not because I don't deserve it, but because I know what I do isn't made for applause. I don't live to please. I live to feel myself, to find myself in my own life. And sometimes that means making decisions no one understands, walking paths others don't want to see, letting go of things that look stable from the outside but are tearing me apart inside. And on exactly those days when no one claps, something grows in me. Something that isn't loud, but steadfast. Something that doesn't shine, but sustains. It is the quiet knowledge that I am on my own side. That I will no longer lose myself just to be loved. That I no longer wait for someone to see me in order to perceive myself. And in that silence, something arises that no applause in the world can replace. Integrity. Chapter 13. The Invisible Weight of a Borrowed Life. It's hard to name the weight of something you don't recognize as a burden. Not at first, not obviously. For it makes no sound, has no clear shape, no name you can easily speak. It's an inner tug you don't understand for a long time, because you believe it's simply part of life, part of what everyone somehow carries. And so you live, sometimes for many years, a life that isn't truly your own, yet feels right long enough so you don't question it. I did that for a long time. I functioned in structures others had laid out for me. I made decisions that felt sensible because they looked good from the outside. I moved as if there were only one socially acceptable direction. And every time doubt or inner discomfort arose, I soothed it with the thought, that's just how it's done. I lied to myself to calm myself down. Because what I lived wasn't born from within me. It was a tangle of expectations, patterns, and learned ideas of what right looked like. I hadn't taken my life. I had inherited it. Like clothing that didn't belong to me but fit well enough to wear. And the tragic thing is, from the outside it looked like success, like maturity, like stability. No one would have guessed that every day I breathed a little harder. The heaviest chains aren't made of steel but of approval. The ones you carry because you don't want to disappoint anyone, because you want to please, because you want to belong. I was diligent, reliable, present. I fulfilled my roles with a discipline that others admired. And deep inside, I still heard that quiet, gnawing question. When does my life actually begin? I didn't ask it out loud. I could barely admit it to myself, for it meant that what I lived was only borrowed. A borrowed life feels like living in an apartment where you're not allowed to paint the walls. You can decorate it, try to make it cozy, but you know you can't change anything fundamental. You live within rules someone else set. And eventually you lose sight of what's your own need and what you simply absorbed. I made decisions that didn't come from my gut, but from, people do it this way. I was reasonable where I should have dared to dream. I was compliant where I should have rebelled. I maintained relationships that gave stability but no depth. I lived in places that felt suffocating though they offered security. And I called it living. But inside I grew quieter. Not calmer, but emptier. I functioned, yes. But I didn't really live. I felt a kind of emotional numbness I couldn't name. It took time, patience, and painful honesty to recognize. I had never allowed myself to discover who I am when nobody expected anything from me. When no one's gaze defined me. I remember a moment that shook me awake. It wasn't an event, no crisis, just an afternoon alone with nothing to do. And suddenly there was this void. Not because I was bored, but because I didn't know what to do with myself when no one defined who I should be. I had spent so long explaining myself through others, daughter, partner, friend, colleague, that I barely felt myself when those roles no longer filled the space. That was the moment I began to feel the weight, not as a blow, but as a creeping realization that I was carrying something that wasn't mine, that I had fitted myself into a life that offered support, but no truth. And I knew, if I continue like this, I will never find myself. I may even succeed by outside measures, but I will never arrive, not within myself. The way back to me wasn't a planned process. It was a series of small decisions, honest conversations, unsettling questions, silences I endured instead of instantly filling them. I stopped telling myself comforting stories. I began to ask questions for which I had no quick answers. What do I really want? What have I taken on without examining it? What scares me most when I think of change? And what I found wasn't immediately clear or beautiful or inspiring. What I found was chaos, contradictions, unfulfilled longings, and a part of me that had been so long overlooked, it had almost fallen silent. But I stayed with myself. I didn't look away. And the more I turned toward myself, the lighter the burden became. Not the life itself, but the carrying of it. Because the borrowed life can only be released when I take responsibility for what I carried until now. For the decisions made from fear rather than freedom. For the version of me I created to survive, not to live. And that required no judgment, but compassion. For me. For the girl who adapted because she knew nothing else. For the woman who carried it all so long believing she had to be that way. Today I no longer feel that weight. Not because my life has become easy, but because it is mine. I carry it differently. I stand up for what feels right, even when it's uncomfortable. I take steps that guarantee no safe landing, but that are real. I no longer need external permission to change what no longer fits. And I know none of this is a given. It was earned, felt, fought for. And maybe in the end, that's the difference between a life that functions and one that truly belongs to you. Chapter 14. Even anger saved me. For a long time, I believed anger was a sign of weakness, something to control, to catch, to keep small. I didn't want to be the difficult one, not the hysterical, loud, inconvenient one. I learned early that being good is rewarded, that gentleness is appreciated, that conformity is safe. So I became quiet, diplomatic, understanding, even when everything inside me was burning. But the anger was there, waiting. Deep down, locked beneath layers of reason and consideration. It didn't always show itself directly. It appeared as fatigue, as inner tightness, as sudden irritability I couldn't explain. It surfaced when I'd been overlooked again, when I'd remained silent when I should have spoken up, when I'd smiled when I really wanted to walk away. I ignored it, and it kept waiting. Until one day, it refused to wait any longer. I remember exactly the moment it burst through with full force. I wasn't in danger. No one had directly hurt me. It was a banal conversation, but something in it was the straw that broke the camel's back. I heard myself speak, harsh, direct, loud. And for the first time, I wasn't frightened by it. I was awake, alive, clear. And I knew, that is me. Not the version that conforms, not the one that shrinks. That was the voice of a woman who had had enough. I was ashamed of my anger for so long. I explained it away afterward, apologized, softened it, rounded it off. Because I thought anger was dangerous. Yet it was precisely anger that protected me. It stood up when I couldn't. It spoke what I had held back for too long. It reminded me, you are here. You feel. You need something. And you have the right to say so. Anger is not the problem. The problem is what we've learned to do with it. Suppress it, condemn it, pathologize it, especially when it comes from a woman's mouth. I have seen so many women who speak clearly labeled as aggressive, ridiculed when they raise their voices, denied their right to emotion the moment they become inconvenient. And I went along with it silently. I apologized where I should have stood my ground. But then, when my life began to tip, when I no longer knew how to kindly explain that something hurt me, when I could no longer negotiate calmly without breaking inside, that's when anger arrived. And it didn't come to destroy. It came to clear a path. It wasn't blind. It was sharp, crystalline. And it showed me where I had betrayed myself. It was anger that made me stand up when I would have preferred to stay down. It told me, enough is enough. Not tomorrow. Not after the next attempt. Not when it suits everyone else. Now. I listened and I followed. And what I found was not devastation, but liberation. I began to allow it, not in the sense of an outburst, but as part of my inner truth. I stopped analyzing, dampening, or sugarcoating it. I let it be. When I felt it rising, I breathed deeper. I wrote. I spoke. I stood up for myself even if my voice trembled. I said no, not quietly, not cautiously, but clearly. I left when I'd already stayed too long. And I knew, this is not destruction, this is healing. Because anger is often just pain drawing a line. An inner stop sign that's been ignored too long. It shows where it hurts, where you lost yourself, where you explained yourself one time too many though no one asked how you really were. Anger says, I won't keep pretending this is okay. And yes, it burns. But sometimes something must burn for you to breathe again. I learned to see it as part of my strength, not as the opposite of love, but as its fiercest defense. For anyone who loves themselves, who takes themselves seriously, will be angry when hurt, won't stay silent when their boundary is crossed, won't say it's fine when it isn't. And that's exactly what I hadn't done for so long. Today I no longer fear my anger. I know how it feels when I suppress it, and how it feels when I give it space. It's not a monster. It's a messenger. And I listen to it, even when it gets loud, even when it's inconvenient, even when it unsettles others. Because it has taught me more about myself than all the years of just functioning. Anger taught me where I wasn't free yet, where I was still stuck in roles, patterns, ideas of myself that no longer fit. It helped me be honest, not polite, not accommodating, but true. And in that truth, I began to feel myself again. I won't stay angry forever, and I don't want to, but I will never again pretend there's no place for it in my life. Because the day I reclaimed it, I began to take myself seriously, and that changed everything. Chapter 15. When normal no longer was enough. There was a time when I clung to the idea of normality as if it were my safest anchor. I told myself that it was good that everything ran on a schedule. I convinced myself that routine protected me, that stability was more important than excitement, that life didn't always have to tingle to be worthwhile. And so I lived as many do, structured, diligent, compliant, in a daily routine that didn't hurt, but also didn't move me, in a life that functioned but didn't vibrate. I had learned that normality is something good, a goal, something you achieve when you've done enough right, a rhythm you've earned by meeting expectations you never set yourself. And at first it truly felt comforting. No dramas, no upheavals, no surprises. I knew what would happen. I knew how to react. I wasn't overwhelmed, but I also wasn't really alive anymore. The unease didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, like a fatigue you initially ignore, a gentle tug in your chest when you wake up, a silent feeling of tightness even though nothing concrete is pressing. I began to move through my days rather than experience them. I counted hours, not moments. I smiled when it was expected but felt nothing. And I told myself that was normal. That's just life. Then came a day, a seemingly ordinary evening, when I slid my key into the lock and felt how heavy my own routine had become. Not because of a specific problem, but because everything had remained so frighteningly the same. because I had lost myself in that sameness. And I knew. What I call normal is actually a state in which I slowly abandoned myself piece by piece. I wasn't unhappy. And that's what made it so hard to question. There was nothing I could really complain about. I had an apartment, a job, people around me. I had structure, security, reliability. But I barely kept an eye on myself. I stopped asking what inspired me, what challenged me, what truly fulfilled me deep inside. And that was the moment I realized. This normal life I had built for myself was too small for the woman I had become. It wasn't wrong. It was just too tight. It no longer fit. Like a dress you once loved that supported you, but now digs into your shoulders. And it's a quiet pain to admit that, because it means you've changed. You've grown. And what once carried you now holds you back. It takes courage to admit that when everyone around you says, "It's fine just the way it is." I began to ask myself what I was missing. Not in the world, but within me. I remembered old dreams, ideas I'd shelved because they were unrealistic. I thought of things that used to make my heart race, but that I filed away once adulthood arrived. And I saw how often I told myself, "It's too late for that." Or, "It won't make any difference." And in all those sentences lay a quiet surrender, one that dressed itself up as reason, but was in truth self-abandonment. I wanted more than normal, not in the sense of bigger, faster, further, but in the sense of deeper, truer, more authentic. I no longer wanted to glide through days. I wanted to burn again, to feel, to question, to set out. I wanted to ask myself questions I didn't immediately know the answers to. I wanted to discover what stirred in me when I no longer followed expectations but longings. So I began to change small things. No radical cuts, no fleeing, but a slow questioning of the familiar. I said no where I would have said yes by default. I scrutinized my routines. I regularly asked myself, do I really want this? Or am I doing it only because it's expected of me? And with each question, my perspective sharpened, not on the world, but on myself. I lost people on that path, not because they were bad, but because our connection was based on the version of me that had settled for normal. And I gained space, within, and eventually without as well. I relearned how to feel myself, even when it was uncomfortable. I learned to see my inner restlessness not as a problem, but as an invitation to dig deeper, to the place where life is not smooth but real. Today I know I will never go back to a life that feels right only because it pleases others. I don't need a normality that pacifies me. I need a life that feels like mine. And sometimes that is uncomfortable. It is uncertain. It is loud and contradictory. But it is mine. And for me, that is more than enough. Chapter 16. I'm not broken. I'm rewriting myself. For a long time I believed that break and end were one and the same, that something that shatters cannot be mended. But I have learned that the moment after the break is not the end. It is the beginning, the start of something more honest, more raw, and at the same time more powerful. I'm not broken. I have freed myself from what confined me, and now I'm rewriting myself. I remember a day when I barely recognized myself in the mirror, not because I hated who I saw, but because I saw how much I had inflicted on myself over the years. All the decisions I'd made just to fit in, to please, to avoid risk. Everything I gave up in order to belong or to seem stable. And that day wasn't a turning point. It was the final moment when I realized, if anything is to start anew, it starts now. My writing began quietly. No fireworks, no grand gesture, just a cautious testing of my own words. I started to think out loud when I was alone. I wrote, at first chaotically, unstructured, contradictory. I wrote about myself, not about roles, not about expectations, not about goals. I wrote about me, what I felt, what moved me, what drained me, what could wake me up. It wasn't easy. At times it felt as though I were standing on shifting ground, because I had no idea who this new version of myself would be. And that scared me. The woman I had been was a result of habits, learned patterns, the image others held of me. And now there was this glow inside me, inexperienced, unvarnished. I didn't try to control it. I let it exist, in its uncertainty. And from that emerged a new kind of trust. In this process, I learned that what I thought was broken was in truth the seed of something better. I was not destroyed. I was ready for change. And from that readiness, my new self was born. It meant turning back to old dreams, acknowledging myself without guilt. It meant redefining boundaries, realigning, reinventing. I stopped wrestling with projections. I stopped imposing standards on others, in friendship, in love, at work. I began to ask myself, what do I actually want? With no filter, no regard for hypothetical reactions. And I let the answers stand, even when they sounded small, even when they didn't sound loud enough, even when I had no idea where it might lead. Little by little, the small things of the new life appeared. I made choices that weren't part of a strategy, but impulses. A weekend alone. A course nobody recommended. A break that didn't fit the picture. A conversation I had without justifying why it mattered to me. And every time I switched on that beacon inside me, life became clearer, more alive. I felt again what's possible when you don't just react, but create. I'm not perfect. This new version of me is full of contradictions, sometimes insecure, sometimes bold, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet. But it is real. It is rewritten. And I don't cling to rigid rules. I allow myself to keep evolving. Because I know life is not a closed book but an open document, written as long as we breathe. I've given myself permission to rewrite myself as often as necessary. I release myself from the compulsion to be complete, finished, or perfect. And in doing so, I've created space to discover myself. In highs and lows, in certainties and doubts, in complexity and contradiction. Perhaps this is the greatest lesson, that what we worry about all our lives, perfection, continuity, clarity, are actually burdens. That real change is not a straight line, but a path of breaks, mistakes, setbacks, and new beginnings. That being does not end when something stops, but starts again right there, unvarnished, honest, unfinished. I'm not broken. I'm rewriting myself. And that is the greatest project I have ever begun. With every word I find, with every decision born from within, a bit more of me shines through. Unfinished, but genuine. And that is what matters. Chapter 17. Freedom also hurts. The idea of freedom sounds beautiful, sounds easy, sounds overwhelming. But it has another side that is rarely described. The side that hurts. Because freedom not only means departure, but also farewell to certainties, securities, old identities. And sometimes, it's precisely that pain that keeps us from truly feeling free. For freedom has its price. It demands that we let go of the old, even when we're not yet ready to fill the emptiness. I recall that one moment when I realized I was on the brink, but my heart was still pulling back. My mind said, "You are free." But something in me wanted to hold on, didn't want to let go. It wasn't doubt about the path, but sadness over what I was leaving behind. And in that hesitation, I understood. Freedom is not just the feeling of air under your wings. It is also the burning you feel when you leave the nest. The first steps into that freedom were incredibly exhausting, not physically, but inwardly. My heart raced, my breath grew shallow, my thoughts looped. I had convinced myself for so long that comfort was fine because it was safe. And now I felt how dearly I had grown to love that comfort, that order, that predictability. Yet, precisely because of that, I broke free, even though it hurt. It hurts to let go of what you know, even if it causes you pain. It feels like opening a wound by your own will, because something will die, not physically, not dramatically, but energetically and emotionally. A life that adapted, a routine that felt easy, a role you played, and that loss is real. Not bitter, but not silent either. It demands space, it demands time, it demands tears, reflection, reorientation. I often asked myself whether I missed the squeaky certainties, the approving glances, the knowledge of where I belonged. I was ashamed that it affected me, because I had consciously chosen freedom. I read books, listened to podcasts, found role models. I thought I understood. But I had underestimated the soft side of it, the vulnerability. Freedom hurts. Not because it is wrong, but because it is real. It forces you to redefine yourself, without roles, without expectations, without patterns. And in that old emptiness, you suddenly realize how much you needed those patterns, even though they kept you small. There were evenings when I didn't know who I was when no one was watching, when I no longer functioned or got labeled. I stood in the kitchen, exhausted, without a plan, and didn't know what to do with myself. That was the moment when I understood. Freedom is more than a state. It is work. It is enduring when life hasn't yet given you a new shape. It is trusting yourself before the world offers anything. I learned to face that vulnerability, not by throwing myself into plans again, but by simply breathing. I took time to do nothing. I cried without explanation. I went for long, aimless walks, and with every step, a little weight fell away. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. I have come to understand that freedom is not the opposite of pain, but its greatest compass, because it takes you where you truly want to go, but also forces you to say farewell where farewell is due. And that is an act of courage, not a trial by fire, but a daily choice to not hold life in old stories just because they are comfortable. Today I feel freedom, and I feel its price. And I know there is no better way. A life that remains stable forever is a life with hidden boundaries. A life that keeps us from ourselves. But a life with pain and freedom is a life that makes you real, genuine. Sometimes freedom hurts, but it is not a pain that harms you. It is one that reminds you. You are bigger than your fears. Your story is only just beginning, and you are allowed this freedom. Even if it startles you, it also heals. Chapter 18. I'm not here to fulfill others' expectations. It often begins inconspicuously. A compliment that sets a norm, advice wrapped as caring, a facial expression telling you how to appear before you've spoken. For years, I picked up those quiet signals as commands, molded myself into the shapes others had designed for me, learned to mirror myself in their gaze instead of in my own feelings, because approval is addictive when you experience it early enough. I became adept at reading the temperature of a room, discovering what was expected of me more quickly than sensing my own pulse, and every time I conformed, I believed it was about love. Yet deep inside, a weariness gathered that knew no rest. Because you can never rest as long as you're walking someone else's map. I remember one day sitting in my car between two appointments, the engine running, hands gripping the wheel, and suddenly realizing I no longer knew whether my calendar had anything to do with my life. There were commitments, meetings, projects, each of which looked sensible in isolation, but together formed an image that no longer reflected me. I saw that I had turned my existence into a question-answer machine. I reacted, I fulfilled, I confirmed, but I created nothing that came from me. And in that silent realization, something rose inside me that first sounded like defiance, later like clarity. I'm not here to fulfill others' expectations. It wasn't a heroic moment or a rebellious gesture, but an internal flipping of an old premise. From that point on, I began to give my answers more slowly, examine my commitments more thoroughly, and stop automatically filling my days just because gaps in someone else's plan felt oppressive. I declined invitations I had already accepted, called back to turn a maybe into a no, and felt the unrest of disappointment on the other end like a cold draft. Yet I stood my ground. For disappointment is often nothing more than the sound of falling expectations, and that sound belongs to the one who harbored them, not to the one who accidentally brings them down. I discovered that not all expectations were spoken aloud. Some lived in my own mind, in ideas of how I needed to appear, reliable, smart, in control. Those inner voices demanded their toll whenever I set boundaries. I would catch myself thinking, "You don't do that. You can't leave people hanging. You must show up. You can't break character." But each time I gave in, I felt a piece of my authenticity flake off like paint from a long-faded wall. I learned to untangle myself from these inner dialogues by asking a simpler question. Do I really want this? Or do I just want it to look good? If the answer lay only in the external, I knew I was on the verge of surrendering to outside control again. Sometimes that meant turning down an apparently golden offer. Sometimes letting an old contact quietly fade away. Sometimes falling silent mid-sentence before promising something beyond my capacity. And in each of those moments, freedom vibrated in my chest like a new organ, unfamiliar but unmistakably alive. The world responded in mixed ways. Some took my no as personal failure, as if I had snatched a fixed image from their hands. Others seemed relieved, as though they saw for the first time a genuine outline they could orient themselves by. I realized that authenticity doesn't always please because it turns the mirror back. When I no longer perform, the protection my conformity offered others is gone too. But instead of retreating, I stayed present. I learned to endure a dissonant counterpart without bending myself, and found that relationships capable of holding that tension grow, while fleeting connections fall apart as soon as you stop nodding. Over time, that initial assertion evolved into a quieter, deeper stance. I no longer had to loudly defend my boundaries. My presence shifted on its own. I entered rooms without measuring their temperature, spoke without scanning faces, listened to myself while I talked, and let my words stand, even if they received no immediate nod of approval. Sometimes, 3 seconds of silence mean more self-determination than 1,000 well-argued points. Mastering that silence took practice, but it became my ally because it showed. I am available, but not malleable. The most exciting discovery was that behind all those shed expectations lay my own curiosity. Freed from the urge to prove something, I began learning things that served no plan, listening to people who challenged my beliefs, walking paths that promised no applause. The less I tried to fit an image, the clearer I saw what truly moved me. Uncomfortable questions, unexplored topics, encounters without a safety net. Suddenly, days once packed with others' instructions became open fields where I could experiment, not to deliver results but to collect experiences. Were there relapses? Of course. Sometimes I still catch myself agreeing before checking how far my resources stretch. But the difference is that now I notice. I pause, breathe, course correct, inform those affected, and explain, without shame, why I need to reschedule. Some understand immediately, others don't at all. Yet in both cases my self-loyalty remains intact, and that is ultimately the only constant I owe myself. I've promised myself not to be a monument to expectations, neither others nor my own outdated ones. I allow myself to leave roles, even if they once supported me, and I'm ready to realign whenever life shows I'm living too much in mirrors again. This doesn't mean unreliability, but authenticity. He who knows what he stands for can say yes and no more clearly, instead of dissolving in half-hearted compromises. In the end, it's not about despising expectations. They're part of every relationship, every community. But I choose which to accept, negotiate, or reject. That freedom of choice is my compass, my inner contract with myself. And each time I honor it, my strength grows, and so does the respect of those who also show up without bending. That's how connections form, not on roles but on clarity. And that is a foundation that holds because it is real and doesn't pretend that approval can replace love. I'm not here to fulfill others' expectations. I'm here to live my life so honestly that it needs neither excuses nor masks for me to recognize myself when the day grows still and only my own breath fills the room. Because only then do I know I truly belong to myself, and everything that remains has substance. Chapter 19. Not everything I lost was a loss. There is a certain kind of silence that only follows a farewell. Not loud, not dramatic, but rather like an echo that slips into everyday life when something that once breathed with you suddenly no longer does. I have experienced many of these silences. Some came after decisions I made myself. Others were imposed on me, like a door slamming shut before you could fully pass through. And yet, today, with a clarity I didn't choose but earned, I can say not everything I lost was a loss. For a long time I treated everything that left me as a gap, a lack, a sign that I had failed or wasn't good enough to hold on. I clung to relationships that no longer touched me, to routines that only functioned but meant nothing, to places, stories, versions of myself I no longer lived, simply because I believed holding on was valuable, that only what remains matters, and what goes always brings pain. But the truth was different. With each so-called loss, something inside me grew freer. With every seeming defeat, a weight fell away I didn't know was exhausting me. I began to look closer. What was it really that I lost? Was it love, or just the idea of it? Was it closeness, or merely habit? Was it security, or simply the familiar that long held me small? It was a process to ask those questions, because it takes courage to admit you don't have to mourn everything. That some disappearances are not misfortune but recovery. I let people go who didn't see me, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. I gave up dreams I'd carried for years, simply because I thought I had to make them real, just because they once mattered. I shed roles in which I no longer felt myself, and said goodbye to notions of success that were never mine but borrowed, like wearing an ill-fitting dress out of obligation. Letting go wasn't easy. It came with uncertainty, that bitter taste when you lose something before you are sure you couldn't have saved it. But in that gray zone, in that hesitation, I learned, not all pain is wrong. Sometimes it's just unfamiliar, and not all that remains is right. Sometimes it simply persists. Today I know, losing is not always a loss. Sometimes it's clarification, liberation, a quiet sorting of things that no longer serve. And sometimes you need absence to recognize value. Not necessarily the value of what's gone, but of the emptiness that remains. Because emptiness is not an enemy. It's an invitation, space, possibility. And often that very emptiness was the most fertile ground for something new to grow. I recall days when I thought I'd given up too much, when I feared I'd gone too far, been too uncompromising, too proud, too demanding. But each time I felt into myself, there was no echo of regret, but a silence that felt peaceful, No jubilation, no euphoria, just calm. And that calm was new and healing. Not everything I left behind was wrong, but it was no longer my home. And that is a distinction you only grasp when you allow yourself to move on, not just because it's easier. I began to rewrite my definition of loss. I replaced the word with movement, growth, a return to myself. And suddenly everything made sense in a new way. I didn't lose a face. I regained my own contours. Today I can look back with gratitude on things that once tore me apart, on people whose absence I feared, on paths that ended, on doors that wouldn't open. They gave me something I wouldn't have seen had they stayed. The chance to clarify myself, honestly, stripped of scenery. And that clarity is something no one can ever take from me, because it comes from within, not from search, but from living. I have learned you needn't feel guilty when something ends, that an ending is no proof of inadequacy, and that letting go of something you once loved is not a sign of weakness. You can stay true to yourself and still walk away. You can end something and look back with dignity, and you can view losses not as wounds, but as expansions. Yes, there are things I have lost, but I have also rediscovered what truly belongs to me. My voice, my direction, my measure. I am not emptier because of what went. I am clearer, and that is not loss, but gain. Chapter 20. Peace is not always gentle, but it belongs to me. Peace. For a long time, that word carried connotations of silence, soft light, an inner smoothness that envelops and soothes. I imagined peace meant nothing ever hurt again. All questions were silenced. The world no longer scraped against me. But the more I let go, left behind, and began anew, the more I realized the peace that remains is not always gentle. It is not always easy. And sometimes it doesn't even feel like peace. But it is mine, and that is all that matters. The peace I carry today did not come from outside. No one gifted it to me. No relationship offered it. No achievement guaranteed it. I earned it inch by inch, with every decision that displeased, with every trembling boundary I drew, with every no that knotted my stomach but freed my soul, with every lonely step taken honestly. It was not a straight path, not a clear plan. I stumbled often, doubted, shook, and sometimes, amid the chaos, I wondered if it was worth it. If this so-called peace wasn't just an illusion, a promise of some state where everything fits. But today I know, peace is not a state but an attitude, a decision, renewed again and again. I used to think peace must be easy, soft, undisturbed. But the peace that lives in me is edged, scarred, storied. It is not smooth, not perfect, not radiant, but it is real. And it belongs to me because I didn't sneak it, didn't buy it at the cost of myself, didn't negotiate it at the expense of my values. I found it when I stopped fighting, against myself. I learned that peace sometimes means no longer needing to be right, no longer needing to please, no longer needing to explain who I am. Just being, existing, in a space where I can breathe without shrinking, in a life that may never be easy but is no longer foreign. This peace is not free of pain. Sometimes it is uncomfortable. It shows me things I long suppressed, old patterns, new uncertainties, quiet loneliness. But it stays with me. It does not flee when things get hard. It doesn't demand proof or applause. It simply is, still, constant, like a part of my breath. And the strange thing is, the more I accept this peace as it is, the calmer I become amid the noise. Not because the noise has vanished, but because I no longer fear it. Because I know where my center lies. And because I no longer lose it just because someone outside is shouting. I've stopped comparing myself to others. Their peace is not mine. Their paths are not mine. I don't have to live as others wish. I don't have to be quieter than I am, nor louder just to avoid disappearing. I may be myself, even if that is uncomfortable, even if it isn't everyone's idea of a simple version of me. For this peace is no mask or compromise. It is the sum of my clarities, my setbacks, my choices. It is the answer to what I have survived and what I have finally released. It is not always beautiful, but it is true, and that is, for me, more important than anything. I have stopped believing peace means nothing ever hurts. Today I know. It means I am no longer torn apart by pain, because I no longer lose myself. I no longer flee. I stay with myself. Perhaps with time this peace will grow quieter. Perhaps it will expand or shift. But one thing will never change. I am no longer willing to give it up. Not for love, not for approval, not for a life that feels prettier but separates me from myself again. Because this peace is not perfect. But it belongs to me. And I have learned that that is enough. Perhaps for the first time in my life. And that, precisely that, is what freedom feels like, even when it isn't always gentle. Thank you for coming this far. If this audiobook moved you or made you think, feel free to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. And if you'd like, write in the comments what it stirred in you. I'll be reading. Until soon, and happy listening.